Montreal, 1985. Members of a private club have dressed up as figures of colonial times, reminiscent of 19th and 20th century costume balls. The balls reflected nostalgia
and impressive rooms in England,
and pride for British rule. Later ones were more lighthearted, like this one in Quebec City in 1924. A woman by the name of Nora Peters wore this dress. And then her daughter, Eileen Peters, was pictured in it again in 1927, which brings us to today. So I'm at this Social History Museum of Montreal. Last one. So I'm here at the McCord Stewart Museum. It's Montreal's social history museum, and it houses many, many objects, dresses, items of material culture that tell us a lot about our society here in Montreal, in Quebec, and in Canada. I received an email from curator and fashion historian Cynthia Cooper about a dress that has a huge story, but it starts off all the way in Virginia and somehow finds itself in a closet in the Laurentians.
I'm Cynthia Cooper. I'm head of collections and research and curator of dress, fashion, and textiles at the McCord Stewart Museum in Montreal. Every object has a story, and it's my job as curator to find those stories and bring them out.
After seeing these images of Nora and Eileen Peters in the museum's archives while she was preparing an upcoming exhibition, Cynthia Cooper zeroed in on the dress and realized that in her 30 years of work, she'd never seen it.
And she, in the society pages, she described it as her grandmother's great-great-grandmother's dress and named Janet Ewing. And typically, when we have a garment of this age, we know nothing about it. In this case, we were able to trace the journey of this dress from colonial Virginia to New York City, to Shelburne, Nova Scotia, to Quebec City.
Cynthia says she became kind of obsessed with tracing the history of the dress because of how old it is, and because as she began to dig, she found out more and more about its journey.
I found Janet Ewing. I found her death record in Quebec City. I was also able to find at the time she died, she was the widow of a baker, John Ewing.
Okay, so Quebec City is the last place, but the journey actually, you said, starts in Virginia. Cynthia found a baker by the name of John Ewing on a census in Shelburne, Nova Scotia in 1786. Comparing signatures, she was able to determine that it was the same person.
And the fact that he was living in Shelburne at that moment could only mean one thing, that he was a refugee from the American Revolution.
Thanks to property loss claims that John Ewing filed, Cynthia was able to learn that he and Janet had lived in Portsmouth, Virginia, and that they had lived in New York for a while before heading to Shelburne, where some 30,000 loyalists initially settled, including 3,000 Black loyalists, making it one of the first and largest Black communities in Canada.
Sometimes Black loyalists would come up and they would, they ran away from their owners, they get freedom, but sometimes their owners or their former owners, go up as well and they work as servants. And I always tell people, so I have this cat, big kitten.
So this is Amani Whitfield. He's been studying the history of Black Maritimers for decades. He wrote 5 books about the subject, plus one about slavery in early Vermont.
I always tell my students, there's a difference between freedom and meaningful citizenship. There's a huge difference, right?
During the American Revolutionary War, the British government promised thousands of Black soldiers freedom if they fought alongside British soldiers. And so many of those Black people were among the first to experience emancipation. They ended up in Shelburne, along with the slaves of middle-class loyalists fleeing the United States.
It would be like being in a modern-day refugee camp. You've got to imagine all of a sudden, you've got 30,000 people there. All of a sudden, Shelburne turns into what? the second or third largest city in all of North America, people are starting to realize, like, do we really want to live here? Because it's the literal middle of nowhere.
And white people were disgruntled. A riot broke out wherein angry white people in Shelburne attacked black residents and burned their houses down. Because he wasn't able to set up his business, John Ewing filed another claim for losses to the British government.
I began to wonder, was John Ewing a slaveholder?
A baker could own a slave? According to a 1772 tax record from Portsmouth, John Ewing could and did. See, right there on the record, a single name, Bob.
And wherever there's a single name in these titleable lists, it indicates that that's an enslaved person. Their names, last names are not given.
As slavery spreads out in the North and parts of the Upper South into middling artisanal ranks, that's when these people start to buy in. I just looked in my biographical dictionary and I have like 1,465 names in there, and I didn't find him. But see, that could also mean that he did come with them. But black people never were given land in any substantial way. Of course, if you can't make a go of it on the farms, you are automatically going to have to become laborers for hire. And it is in this system that they are very prone to re-enslavement.
Amani says slavery in the North used to be seen as more benevolent than on Southern plantations, but he says it's important to see what they have in common.
Like, what experiences are similar? Like, what attitudes that owners have about the exploitation and use of black labor.
That exploitation is part of how white loyalists were trying to climb social ranks. Historians like Amani Whitfield say social mobility was a big motivator for a lot of them. In fact, they were kind of obsessed with it. And that could explain why our baker's family could own this blue silk embroidered ball gown.
And I think that that's the biggest story in this dress. I think that every time this dress was put in a trunk and loaded on a cart and taken down to a dock and loaded in the hold of a ship, that it was black hands that did that work, that it was black backs that strained under the weight of that trunk, and that each time, although those individuals will remain lost to history, we'll never know who they were, but in their collectivity, in their community, people were feeling at each of those moments that their prospects for the future were going to be very different.
So we don't know what happened to Bob, the person believed to be enslaved by the Ewings. But for Cynthia, this dress traveled alongside changes happening to black people at the time, hopes and false hopes of emancipation. Meanwhile, Janet and John Ewing's descendant, Nora White, became a part of a wealthy family. She and her daughter Eileen Peters both wore the dress at costume balls nostalgic of colonial times and attended by the elite. So this dress is also a symbol of white people's aspirations of wealth and more wealth. The dress climbed the social ladder, just as the Ewings had wanted it, but it also followed immense changes for women and black Canadians.